Here, Richard Nicholson. You're going to sit in this chair.
You need to be my spirit. I think he wants to sit outside.
I'm trying to do it here.
You can just sit in the chair.
Yeah.
I'll read it.
What to do now?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, whatever you.
As you.
Sorry.
And I'll
And
read it.
you'll pull up the slides for me.
I will, yeah, indeed,
Can
yeah.
I just do this?
Yeah, yeah.
Lovely.
And I'll read any questions out. Online, or shall I email them to you?
I'll join you after I'm done. I'll join you.
Okay.
Because there may be too many. people.
Yes, you can group them. Okay, cool.
That's great, Kathy.
As chair, maybe I can come back. after.
Yeah, yeah. So you have your laptop on mute. Remember, to join the Zoom.
I'm already, I'm muted.
Okay, cool.
Wait.
So start whenever you want.
Do you want me to close the door?
Can we turn the screen a bit this way so I can just sit here?
Yeah, I think so. Do you want some? I don't want
I
to.
see the screen as I.
Yeah.
Perfect, perfect, thank you.
Wait. Hello, everyone. Welcome to IDS. And this is our inclusive trade seminar series that is back after a little bit of a break. This is a challenging time, to say the least. We're living in the midst of various complex uncertainties, but it would be fair to say that the role of trade for development remains as pertinent as ever. However, there is an increasing emphasis of the role of trade intertwined with different factors such as structural drivers, macroeconomics, security challenges, and the list goes on. So there can be nobody better than Ganeshan Wignaraja to set us off on our revamped trade seminar series. I am really pleased to introduce Ganesh to this audience today. Ganesh has an impressive number of hats. I'll try to mention just a few. He, in addition to his role as Senior Fellow at ODI, he's also co-editor of ODI's journal, Development Policy Review. He's Professorial Fellow in Economics and Trade at Gateway House in Mumbai. He's also non-resident Senior Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore. And I see this opportunity very much as building on our ongoing collaborations between the Institute of Development Studies and ODI. We also have with us today two stellar discussants, Professor Raphie Kaplinksky, IDS Emeritus Fellow. His research interests have spanned industrial and technology policies, global value chains, the commodities boom and the terms of trade, as well as the impact of China on sub-Saharan Africa and inclusive innovation. Online, we have Indrajit Coomaraswamy, ODI Global. He's also a former governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and currently holds positions in various private sector enterprises. So without further ado, let me invite Ganesh to speak to us today about sovereign default, the role of IMF stabilization and international trade, lessons from Sri Lanka. Thank you, Ganesh. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Amrita. It's really great to be kicking off this inclusive trade series that you are relaunching and to be back at IDS. I'm so thrilled to see old friends, and Sir Richard, of course, is a very, very old family friend, and I'm thrilled and to see collaborators like Dirk Willem and Bernardo and, of course, Lakshman. I knew his dad very well. And it's really a great pleasure. So I guess the sort of starting point for me is that development studies and indeed development economics looks at this idea of models of development. And I recall, if we go back to 1993, the World Bank did the East Asian Miracle Study, and there was this Washington consensus that was there. And that essentially said that if you increase savings and investment, and you invest in skills, and you open an economy, and you have macro stability, countries are going to then emulate the success of Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and other high-performing East Asian economies. I remember IDS had a furious reaction to that. In the bulletin, I remember that year, and I think, Raphie, you were pioneering there. There was Robert Wade, there was John Toy, Richard himself was there, of course, and John Toy, of course, as well. And there was a really interesting heterodox view that came, right? Now, that was about success and ingredients of success. I think less understood is really this concept of models of development reversal, the other way around. And the big question I'm trying to pose to all of us today is Sri Lanka a classic case of development reversal? Right? Going from a basic needs success, work that Richard, Jim Grant, Paul Streeton, a whole lot of people in that genre worked on, Amartya Sen, in fact, as well, where you increase investments in human capital and health and education, and Sri Lanka was seen as the exemplary country, to sliding into debt default and economic crisis in 2022. So is it a classic case of development reversal? And should we be thinking about that? And thinking particularly, how do we avoid doing a Sri Lanka? Sorry, I'm trying to get this to go. And essentially, I'm going to try to apply a development economics stroke macroeconomics lens. Should I stand there and do it? Or should work? Maybe I'll just stand here.
Yeah.
It's easier. Yeah. So I'm going to try to apply this macroeconomics development sort of lens to looking at this issue of Sri Lanka. And I'm going to try to answer 4 types of questions that might be of interest to you. The first is, why did Sri Lanka, that is a middle-income country in 2022, and in fact it attained it before, and a basic needs success, slide into this development reversal story, right? And crisis through debt default and economic crisis. Second, what is the outlook for Sri Lanka, having had an IMF program, the 17th program in 2023, and can we assume it's going to come back? Third, and something that Raphie knows a lot about, how can Sri Lanka join supply chains around India, this giant economy that's growing very fast and seen as the new China in some ways? And the last question, probably the most important for us, is what lessons can other countries in Africa, in Asia, be it if you're Ghana, be it if you're Zambia, be it if you are Bangladesh perhaps, or even the Maldives, draw from the Sri Lankan experience? And that's the canvas. Now, Sri Lanka is an economy with $4,500 roughly. Today, it's a small island, and the economy is based on the 3 T's: tea, tourism, and textiles, and 22 million people in population, and it got independence in 1948. So this is just some contextual stuff for you to kind of mull over. And it's these 4 questions that I really want to kind of tackle in today's talk. This is really based on a number of publications. My doctorate was on Sri Lanka and whether it could become a newly industrialized economy, and Palgrave Macmillan published that around 94, 95. And we've done several studies with Dirk Willem and others through ODI on Sri Lanka, and then there's some other papers. So there's a bunch of material you can look at. Let me jump into the first topic about this development reversal story. And I want to focus particularly on the promise of Sri Lanka, and then talk a bit about the contours of a crisis. I will talk about the why in the next bit. So these are 2 rather prominent characters. One is Amartya Sen, of course, who won the Nobel Prize in 1998 for restoring the ethical dimension through his work in welfare economics. If you remember, he talked about human welfare and social justice. And he was one of those who talked about Sri Lanka as a basic needs success story. And he saw the early investments in public health, but also in education that he said started really as early as the 1940s. And a decade or so later, you got the fruits of that. And he really thought that Sri Lanka was exceptional in the astonishingly high life expectancy at birth. I think the average Sri Lankan, as I'll show you, lives 76 years, which is quite exceptional by developing country standards in South Asia. And this was when Sri Lanka was still a low-income country. Right? Health and education were unmatched, even though per capita income was low. So he was thinking a lot about this basic needs model. The other person here is Joe Stiglitz, who also needs no introduction, who won the Nobel Prize in 2001, and for his work really on markets and asymmetric information, particularly in financial markets. And he came to Sri Lanka a few years ago for a conference in 2016 after the end of the conflict. And he thought Sri Lanka was really very well located to sort of exploit this very good endowment of human capital, which was also healthy and extremely good life expectancy and skills and so on. And he thought it could really be a hub in the Indian Ocean, a bit of a Dubai, a Singapore. And he talked about how that could be. Now, these were, very laudable basic conditions, and I want to give you a little sense of the data. This, I think, is quite interesting. So on the location front, Sri Lanka is located 130 odd kilometers from India across the Port Strait, and quite a bit of Sri Lanka's maritime trade is with India. We do transshipment for India. Right? So the big ships come to Sri Lanka, they get unloaded, and they get put onto smaller ships to go to India. And that's quite a bit of our maritime trade. It's also on the east-west sea route to China, a few miles off the coast. So it's ideally situated from a location point of view to be at entrepot. And there was a question mark as to whether, as India eventually gets the iPhone and manufacturing of that type, when these spillovers come to Sri Lanka. And that was a really interesting question. And so far, not very much, not even in the textile and garment sector. So the location is fantastic and was a trading post in British times, but the promise is still there to be had. And here is some data on the basic needs story. You see, by the 60s, the average Sri Lankan lived to, the average Sri Lankan lived to 60 odd years. Infant mortality was only 53. Adult literacy was very high, meaning most Sri Lankans. And then by 2021, it was 76 for life expectancy. Infant mortality had really come down because of the investment in public health. And then the South Asian average for life expectancy 71 years, infant mortality is 30. So much better human indicators than anybody else, right? So in a sense, there was merit in what these two eminent individuals came up with, and thinking that Sri Lanka should really be well set for takeoff once the conflict had ended in 2009, right? But Sri Lanka has really struggled to translate these advantages of location and basic needs into robust economic development, particularly growth. And there's a very interesting article done by two World Bank economists, Ahmed and Rajan, that talked about the growth story. And they were focusing on a particular episode when we began to become more inward-oriented in the 1970s. And the plantations were nationalized, which caused investor flight. And that was the golden goose. The tea, rubber, coconut economy was the golden goose, which funded all the welfare and all these public investments. And the state decided that at the time they would just nationalize all of that because there was this populism and demand for land. And that had a massive impact on exports, on revenue, and so on. Welfare expenditure didn't change, right? And then the promise of state-owned enterprise didn't materialize. So there's a lot of emphasis on state-owned enterprise, which didn't materialize. There was just massive fiscal deficits. And then there was an attempt at import substituting industrialization with haphazard intervention. And the current governor of the central bank, I think Nandalal Veerasinghe sums this up very well. He talks about a low investment, low growth, high unemployment economy by 77. So there was this inward orientation phase in a small economy that didn't work very well. And then there were some reforms, partial reforms in 1977 to open the economy up, but that got retarded a few years later by a 30-year civil conflict. And
And then a few years later, from that point, we go into debt default in 2022 April. It was a preemptive default. It wasn't one where, it was done by external people. It was just preemptive, Sri Lanka decided, because there was only a couple of hours of import cover left in terms of foreign exchange. And the debt to GDP ratio was rising, external debt numbers were rising, foreign reserves fell drastically. And then we had the worst economic and political crisis in the country has faced since independence. We had a contraction of GDP, 7.8%, spiraling inflation, exchange rate volatility, and a doubling of poverty. And the economic collapse also led to political upheaval. The president of the day, who had won with a 2/3 majority, Gotabaya Rajapaksa from the Rajapaksa family, had to flee the country, and Ranil Wickremesinghe becomes president in Sri Lanka. So it was a really interesting story. And here's some numbers, which I think kind of map this a little bit. So when we kind of defaulted, when we defaulted, the debt to GDP was 125%. GDP, the growth rate was negative. The economy contracted during that period. Inflation shot up to 70%, not the hundreds of percents we saw in countries like Zimbabwe and many others that had a spiral, but it was certainly pretty bad for us. And poverty doubled from a country that was known to have 12% income poverty double. So this is one way of seeing this crisis, just to kind of give you a sense of it. The other way is really to see it in pictures. So here were the 3-mile long petrol queues, and I stood in these queues during the crisis, and 3 miles, and people were there for 3 days because we only had 2 hours of import cover, right? And these queues snaked around my house. Richard will remember coming home in Colombo, and it went right around the corner, and there was, 3 days people stood in queues. I stood there for hours and sort of gave up. We didn't drive the car anymore. And then with shortages of basic items, we had mass protests. Ordinary people went and protested in the presidential secretariat. And, you have this sea of faces, which are very clever and very sort of clear. And then the authorities, started fighting back in some way, and tear gas was used and so on. And we didn't have what you had in Bangladesh, where people were actually shot in a few other countries, but we had rubber bullets being used and lots of tear gas, and that enraged people even more. And then there was an attempt at people's power, where the president was basically had to flee the country on a Navy boat. And there's a long, interesting anecdote. He went, I think, first to the Maldives. And then he had to leave there. Then he went to Singapore. He had to leave there. Then he went to Thailand. He had to leave there. And finally, he's come back to Sri Lanka. So it's a full circle of a story. But it's an extraordinary set of events of what happens when you get a debt default and an economic crisis. And I mean, these pictures are very, very fresh in my mind. Okay, now let me talk a bit about why it happened. And I think this is the interesting part from an IDS audience and analytically. Lots of different reasons and a lot written about this. And I like to think of it in terms of 2 broad categories, as economists would do. External factors, things outside the control of people or outside the economy, and internal factors. And external shocks such as COVID, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, the Red Sea crisis, these things are obviously relevant. Another very powerful view is that IMF had mishandled the crisis. So there's a very strong view about that. Then there is the China debt trap story, that China basically did predatory lending by its policy banks, and then took essentially assets in return, so-called China debt trap story. So those are kind of external explanations. And then there are internal factors, which is persistent twin deficits, running a fiscal deficit and a balance of payments deficit for a very long period. Then another explanation is, there's weak structural change and limited manufactured exports. So the diversification we saw in East Asia, so the Korea, Taiwan, and economies like that went from low labor-intensive or low-skill items such as textiles and garments and footwear into electronics, automobiles. That pattern didn't get replicated in Sri Lanka. Right? And then there was a particular set of mismanagement, the so-called homegrown solutions during 2019 to 2022, which kind of pushed the economy off the edge into abyss, as it were. So let me just briefly go through those. So the external shock story talks about these external shocks, and it affected basically tourism, agriculture. My basic take on this is that other middle income countries were also affected by shocks but didn't default. Okay, so there is some truth in this, but it's not sufficient as a story. So it's not somebody else's problem. The world was bad to us, and therefore, we were innocent people like this. So that's kind of important, but not that important. Then there's a very influential view that has come up. People like Chandrasekhar Ghosh and Das talk about this, that Sri Lanka had a chronic dependence on external finance, especially IMF inspired liberalization, and that the IMF treats basically crisis as a technical imbalance in budgets, and that has to be fixed through fiscal tightening and liberalization, and it ignores deep social structural inequalities that underlie this. But the truth is, after 7 quarters of declining growth, the economy came back. So there was a cyclical uptick through IMF stabilization, which came in March of that year. So in a way, that theory again doesn't hold, and the growth elasticity of poverty reduction can also be very significant, right? So again, interesting. If the crisis had continued, maybe there would have been more explanation, power from this explanation. But because it's kind of come back, I think the IMF definitely is the lender of the last resort, and without it, we would have been in deep trouble for sure. A third view is a very powerful one, and Chalansi, the defense analyst from India, sort of articulates this, and he talks about China uses loans, basically commercial loans at 6% to gain strategic assets from indebted countries. And this is a very powerful narrative running through some kinds of thinking. And people like Jeff Smith at Heritage talk about this as well. Very prominent case has been the Hambantota port in southern Sri Lanka. That is dubbed the White Elephant Project. And Mattala Airport are also talked about the fuel debt, sustainability and security concerns. There's visits of spy ships followed that. And so the two are linked, right? The debt. Hambantota port went on a lease, 99-year lease, and that was seen as evidence of the debt trap being manifest, right? So the 99-year lease, although technically it's argued that it's a lease, it's not giving the land, but still. So over the period 2006 to 2022, roughly 13.2 billion in infrastructure loans came from China's policy banks without safeguards. And I'm going to show you a graph in a minute that shows the contribution of China in the debt story of Sri Lanka. And it's high, but not the dominant factor. When we break up the projects, and I visited all these different projects, you get a mix of low return projects and useful projects. So I conclude from all of this, it's a partial debt trap story. It's not a complete debt trap story. In other words, there was a lot of Chinese lending, not though dominant, but there were good and bad projects, right? And that was a problem for Sri Lanka. And the good projects include in Colombo Port, the CICT terminal, which is probably critical for our exports, ironically, to India. Given political economy factor, that's interesting. The Noricele power plant, which is a coal-fired power plant and therefore polluting, gave us the electricity we needed to be able to go from agricultural goods into manufactured garments. Without that, we would not have the power to power the factories, right? So some of those projects were useful, but the port and the airport, I think, were problematic. Here is a graph that tells you the external debt by public holder. And what you see essentially is China in red, and these are in dollars, and you see the contribution of China. So it's important for the debt story, but the green, the ISBs are obviously more important. And Sri Lanka, as it came off concessional money, as it became middle income, had to start borrowing from the commercial markets. And as cheap aid or grant aid kept going. So there is part of this story. So that's why the partial debt trap. Now, the external side has some explanatory power, but probably equally or more important is the story of internal factors. And really, it's that successive governments ran these fiscal and current account deficits for years and years and years. And there were lots of reasons. I mean, one is that there was populist policies really from the 60s onwards with scant attention to revenue generation. And that was a real problem for Sri Lanka. And I gave you that episode of 70 to 77, where, the golden goose, the plantation sector, which generated all the revenue for the welfare state, was basically nationalized. And then there was this massive hit to revenue, to productivity, to exports, but the subsidies and all continued. So we basically used foreign aid and eventually commercial borrowing to kind of finance this. And the electorate, of course, got used to a lot of this. Free health, free education, free welfare, subsidies, and then there was a channel from there to government jobs. The tax base was limited. Lots of exemptions were given to EPZ factories for years and years, even after the end of the conflict. And there was a very high revenue dependence on trade taxes, customs and tax also very inefficient, and some rent-seeking behavior the current government says is there. Concessional money went from NBBs and so on, and commercial borrowing, but commercial borrowing often not for productive use. And that's a problem, to keep the state large or to finance the defense during the conflict. Ag exports, tourism arrival was too low. So that was a very important factor. Twin deficits run for years and years, right? So that was a big problem. Limited structural change is another problem. So lack of firm level technological capability, anti-export bias, lack of clustering, Raphie's specialty, lack of moving into supply chains. And so a lot of this didn't happen either. And here is a kind of a twin deficit graph, which shows you that, we had twin deficits. So the red is the fiscal balance and the blue is the current account, and usually these go together. And essentially, when the deficit became very large or there was a shock, basically went into IMF programs. And we've had 17 of these, since independence. So it is a really interesting picture of this cycle of boom, bust, and then an IMF program. And essentially, the cycles keep repeating themselves, right? So it's a really interesting kind of pattern when you look at this in its terms. Then there was this period 2019 to 2022, where there was a kind of a period of sort of homegrown solutions. People recognized the deficits. COVID had hit and was a problem, but there was a whole set of things that were used. Modern monetary theory, somehow that inflation didn't matter. We can expand the monetary policy as much as we like without any consequences. Inward-oriented policies were also pursued. There was an attempt to boost import substitution, but without the countermeasures that were used in East Asia, such as giving performance measures for firms to export in return for subsidies and other things, which was a classic East Asian thing. And if they hadn't performed, the subsidies were taken away, as in Korea and Taiwan, right? And there was a lot of haphazard state intervention. And some of those things were, tax cuts, which came before that episode, which led to access to capital market in the beginning. So that channel of being able to borrow from the capital market was lost. And then that kind of caused the house of cards to begin to collapse. Exchange rate was overvalued for a long time by using the available reserves to sort of keep a fixed exchange rate. There was somehow a belief that swaps, currency swaps, a short-term instrument at best, could be used to somehow manage debt, and loans from the China Development Bank also were used. Then there was this very bizarre policy. Overnight, the president of the day, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, decided to ban chemical fertilizer that gave a big boost in terms of productivity, and switched to organics without really consulting anybody. And there was a massive fall in agricultural output thereafter, and so on and so forth. And then particularly, the advisors did not want to go to the International Monetary Fund. Okay? And it brought the economy down to 2 hours or 3 hours worth of imports. $40 million was left. Now, basically, foreign exchange is about something around there, $5 billion. So 40 million, maybe something like that. And one can imagine they, want to keep sovereignty and to develop a homegrown. I think there was a belief that China would somehow come to Sri Lanka's rescue, and China didn't come. I have another article if people are interested. So why China didn't rescue Sri Lanka? And the mismanagement, I lived through the 1970 to 77 episode, and I did my doctorate on the opening up. So I looked at that very closely. My own sense, and I have a separate paper on this, which feels that this episode was much worse than the earlier period in terms of the state intervention and homegrown solution. So in a way, when you take the internal and external factors together and you say 100% is the total explanatory power of this, I I think 65-70% is internal, 30% is external. That's the way I would put it. Sure, the shocks hit a weak economy, but domestic policy, in the sense of twin deficits for years and years, regardless of the government. I'm going to show you that chart, as well as that particular episode 2019 to 2022, and the lecture of attention on structural change and trying to shift the economy into higher value addition and exports, probably is really the major explanatory part. And this is the differentiation compared to the East Asian dragon economies, the way I see it. Okay, now what's happened since? So there were three types of interventions which are really interesting. The first is Indian aid, and this came in 2022, and India provided some $3.8 billion. Now, you know, going to the IMF takes time, and the IMF program came in March 2023, right? So with 40 million in the central bank, Sri Lanka would have starved. I mean, that's very simple. There was no fuel, right? We were all walking around. There was no cars. And there was no medicine. I mean, it was really very bad. You know? So India came with this rescue, and the finance minister and Prime Minister Modi together were very instrumental in getting this to come. And India, interestingly, you know, came, and there are various motivations for why India came. One is, you know, humanitarian reasons. That's one. A second is that India has this neighborhood first program and puts a lot of emphasis on its neighborhood. A third is, you know, India wanted to seek an advantage over China, which already now had a footprint in Sri Lanka. So there are various explanations, but all I can say is that it's the largest bilateral aid program India has ever mounted. So at any given time, India has $30 billion in aid that they provide to countries, and they give us 10% of that budget. And think of the number of countries India engages with. So it was a major thing. And it's aid in a strange sense. It's credit lines from Exim Bank, it's deferred loans, it's grants. It's, you know, it's an interesting instrument, whether we call it aid or something else, development finance or emergency money. And then the RBI on top of this provided bilateral and regional swaps. So there was a lot of Indian money that came. And with that, there was an expectation that eventually the trajectory would go from aid to trade, right? And we'll talk about that later. Second important element was the central bank, the government changed, and the current governor was brought back, interestingly, by Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and he did a pretty classic set of policies to try to stabilize the economy. This is prior to the IMF coming, right? He raised interest rates, which was very important. He saw inflation as the biggest problem. And interest rates, there were multiple basis points by which interest rates rose. He allowed the exchange rate to float, so it went from 100 rupees to $1 to about 300-400 at one point. So that was very normal. He took a lot of actions to try to safeguard financial system stability, because in these types of crises, you have a debt default, and then you have the banking system that also collapses, right? So this is a thing that occurred. This did not occur in Sri Lanka because a lot of stress testing is done. And then they tried to negotiate the IMF program, and that came in 2023 March after tough negotiations, and it was a revenue-based fiscal consolidation program aimed at the classic things, and many of these things the IMF had been talking about before in Sri Lanka, so nothing particularly new, just a very tough program. About $3 billion came, and this also unlocked additional money from the World Bank and the ADB, and debt restructuring was very much a part of that process. And if I remember reading this right, external creditors then later restructured $3 billion in debt, and there was another 25 billion of the debt, which was basically extended the lending maturities for 2 decades at low interest rates, and a whole lot of stuff was in. So this was the kind of package of stuff, right? So it wasn't just the fund; other people also were involved. Then we had political change. The president at the time, Ranil Wickremesinghe, decided to go for elections, and he lost to left-leaning Anura Kumara Dissanayake, and the party, the National People's Power, says it's Marxist-Lenin. So it's a really interesting shift that we have. And they promised to bring a compassionate and efficient transformative Sri Lanka out of the crisis, right? And then in the subsequent parliamentary election, his government won a 2/3 parliamentary majority, right? And thus far, they have taken a very pragmatic approach. shelving many of the manifesto commitments that were there. They've kept the IMF program of the predecessors, pro-welfare policies, strong emphasis on education reforms, digitization of government services, another big push, and then particularly robust anti-corruption measures and trying to reduce government waste. But that all said, they have sort of been a bit slower on the privatization of state-owned enterprises, the big loss-making ones, the airline, petroleum corporation, and others. And they are unsure of the trade agenda, the free trade agreement storyline. It doesn't seem clear. And what you've had is, through all of this, a classic cyclical uptick. Okay? And the cyclical uptick, which we see from late 2023, so 7 quarters of declining growth, and then an uptick. There's a base effect. So basically, the economy had collapsed, a relaxation of import controls using low capacity utilization, interest rate cuts supporting business. So it's classic cyclical recovery was engineered, yeah, as opposed to a structural recovery, which I'll talk about in a minute. And here's something in the numbers. The red is the kind of crisis time, and you'll see revenue to GDP was 8%. It's some 13-14% there. Government debt has come down to GDP. Reserves, which were basically very little, has come up to 5 billion roughly. GDP growth goes from negative to positive, but poverty is stubbornly high. Yeah, the growth elasticity has not quite picked it in. And even if you take these numbers a little bit more forward, the reserves are kind of around just under 5 billion. Growth for the first half of this year is 4.8%. A few points about the IMF program, and there's little doubt in my mind, or I mean, the IMF program has helped to turn the economy around. There's no question about that, right? But it's austerity. But I have some quibbles. The resource envelope was very small, and some of this is portrayed by this caricature in the Sri Lankan newspapers. So there you have the IMF, the classic suit. They all come with dark blue suits. I'm wearing dark blue suit today, but I'm not IMF. And there's the president on a bicycle, and the IMF is kind of steering him. So that's the kind of popular perception of where we are. But the resource envelope is small. The debt sustainability analysis is ambiguous assumptions. There are optimistic assumptions for fragile growth, which is said. Very ambitious fiscal adjustment. The primary surplus is 2.3% of GDP for a decade. There's an assumption of favorable external financing. Sri Lanka should regain capital market access in 2027. The rating agencies suggest not quite there. So some of this is a bit optimistic. And the critics argue that it sort of understated the amount needed for debt relief, and then they place a very high burden of adjustment on the people. I think there was inadequate borrow ownership. This is one of the big phrases used in the aid community, and we should have ideally had the sense and to kind of begin to kind of develop our own program and then go to the fund with not just the stabilization measures, which to some extent were done, but also the reforms which are needed for the future. And that's one thing we didn't do. Not enough marketing of the program achievements. The debt to GDP ratio remains still very high even at the program end. So it's a kind of a band-aid when you come to this. And then I think there was insufficient donor coordination between the IMF and the IFIs and the bilaterals. So I think I have some quibbles, but there's a little question in my mind that it was essential part of the turnaround of Sri Lanka and to give confidence for markets and business and others. So what do we make of the outlook? You're getting a recovery, but there's a problematic cycle of cyclical, what Indrajit Coomaraswamy often has termed sugar high growth. It's a kind of a cyclical upturn, right? Really nice because of extra money coming in, right? And in a small country, you can expect cyclical recovery quite quickly, right? 22 million, that's the advantage we have, right? You get the uptick, and you can have quite a long period of cyclical recovery, right? It can go on for a while. Equally well, it can bust very quickly because there's no kind of deep basis to it, right? In terms of all the fundamentals we would want. And even though 4.8% in the first half of this year, IMF latest projections, which were actually released in July, but also reiterated by the Deputy Director of the Asia Department a couple days ago, talks about 3.1% growth in 2026. Okay. And we don't see much productivity in Sri Lanka. Productivity is low compared to other countries, and there's limited structural change. And then there are all these risks. Right? The big one for me is the very high poverty. Right? So the poverty is 24.5%. There's a lot of complaint that food prices in particular remain very, very high. And ag is one of the things that government should have done something about, and also food distribution. I'll talk about that in the suggestions. And then energy costs have also risen dramatically because energy subsidies were taken away, and now that's basically on kind of free market pricing. And there's a lot of social discontent. And part of that social discontent is in the last 3 years, cumulatively, we have lost 1 million Sri Lankans abroad who migrated. So people are voting with their feet. So we're losing a lot of the skilled and the capable and the young. And that's very sad for me personally, having gone to live in Sri Lanka in the way I have. So that's having this equally well. If this is mismanaged, it can fuel social discontent. And you saw those pictures that I showed you of what Sri Lankans have done. So that's an interesting issue. The tariffs are a problem, even though the tariffs have come down 20%, but it's hitting the garment exports. Garment's a very cost-sensitive industry. And with possible job losses as the tariffs start being factored in. And then the big one of policy uncertainty and risk of tepid reforms. Right? So government is very keen on attracting FDI and trying to get private investors, but investors are saying, okay, what's your medium to long-term plan for cutting red tape, for policy credibility, etc. We hope the budget, which is coming in a few days, 7th of November, will be much clearer on this. But I think there needs to be a statement of what government want to do, and also be very clear on what he wants to do with SOEs and so on. And it's very hard to sustain keeping them on the books with such high losses that are there, trying to restructure them. That's a very difficult process. And also the trade agreements. So last year when the president went to India, he committed to the trade deal with India, an upgraded deal. We already have a very simple goods only agreement, which is lots of exclusions, but not much action is there at the moment. And then in 2028, we start having to repay some of the capital. And that's coming very soon, right? In a couple of years, in 2029, if my memory serves right, is the election cycle. So one may expect a cycle where the IMF program ends in 2027. We are without that for some time. We have some reserves. We have a bit of fiscal headroom. Elections are coming up. So you can imagine what 2028 will be like. Open the purse strings. And then in 2029, you can imagine, this sort of tailing down for some kind of a bust, and then another IMF program. So we may have an 18th IMF program, which is much more stringent. And then there is geopolitical competition, which is a big problem, particularly now. So maybe Sri Lanka has to be thinking of this 18th IMF program, ideally homegrown, and with reforms. Let me briefly talk about the integration into supply chains, because we have Raphie, and I'm really thrilled that he's here. And so really the question is, how much can trading post Sri Lanka in the Stiglitz vision integrate into India? Through supply chains. And that's the obvious one, because half of world trade is in supply chains, and India has attracted Apple and Mercedes and many others to come there in Chennai and in Pune, big clusters that have come up. And where does Sri Lanka fit into all this? And what's the possibilities for specialization and trade in parts and components trade and intermediates? Here's an interesting picture, which I think is worth picking. This is world shares of intermediate goods exports. And the story really is, and as of 2023, that's where the data are, China is still a very key part of this, right? It's still 20%, China plus Hong Kong of the world. US is only 7-8%. And you can see what the fuss is all about, right? And why deindustrialization in advanced countries, except European Union, which is interesting, and because Eastern European countries are also there, right? So a lot of that stuff has gone to Eastern Europe, which is cheaper and so on. But in the classic sense of Japan and the US, you see the problem. India is emerging, and you see the slow growth, but it's not that big in this trade, right? 1.5% of global supply chain trade. This is on the export side, right? When you look at the import of such items, India is the world's 5th largest importer. So the Apple and the Mercedes and all that are importing a lot of stuff, and India is integrating that way, but we're yet to see the export story. There's a lot of domestic demand, a big domestic market, the supply base is weak. So it's a classic story of an early stage story. Now, the rest of South Asia is hardly there. That includes Sri Lanka. Yeah. So that's the potential that is there. Sri Lanka could maybe do some of the auto parts for Indian auto industry. Some bits of the iPhone might come. Food processing for sure. Textiles, some bits of textiles. For instance, we also make pepper. The pepper is exported to India without any processing. So there is stuff that can be done. One or two Sri Lankan companies have gone and invested in India. So we have our largest textile company, Brandix, that has gone to India and set up a big textile hub in the south. And a couple of other players have gone. And there are Indian investors that have come, but they have to watch and see. Adani has come in infrastructure and in energy with mixed results, and there are a few others that are interesting. In the digital stack, there is a whole type of investment around the digital side. So we're waiting to see how they can all go, because services are a critical part of the supply chain. It's not just about goods, right? Services, if I remember right, Patrick Lowe, who has done work on this, has said services are the big part of the supply chain in terms of value addition, if I remember right. So there is a lot that can be done. This is obviously plays right into Krugman's important insight. He also won the Nobel Prize for work on geography and trade. But the problems are these complex historical ties, right, which we have had. Years ago, the IPKF was in Sri Lanka as a kind of a peacekeeping force, and then got embroiled into a domestic conflict. India has always been seen as sort of a big neighborhood economy, with in relation to a small one like Sri Lanka. The Chinese presence in Sri Lanka in this period of infrastructure, plus the spy ships and so on, had created tensions. And then this global trade uncertainty have also been an issue. But earlier this year, there was a commitment to better ties. President Dissanayake met Mr. Modi in India, and there was an attempt to do a few small things. But the thinking I have is that much more can be done to alleviate this bilateral, to emulate the close cooperation that you get in the Greater Mekong sub-region, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos. This type of cooperation, I think, is what we could think about in Sri Lanka. And part of it is the supply chain story, particularly business-to-business links, which I think are critical, and particularly with the 4 South Indian states. And Delhi and Colombo can pilot a production-linked incentive scheme. So if you do more trade, you get more incentives. So it's a performance-based measure, which I think are very important. Physical infrastructure is obviously critical. Trade agreements are very important. And if India and Sri Lanka do this well, it can be a model to enhance neighborhood first policy in India's own status as a regional power. So I think this can work very, very well, but a lot more has to be done. Let me just come to the policy lessons and then just conclude. So there are 5 lessons that I think other countries should consider taking from the Sri Lankan story of development reversal and going through crisis and then beginning to come through recovery. The first is, if you see the warning signs and you need a good early warning system, is really to go to the IMF early. I think that's very simple. IMF is a lender of the last resort. They come with a very predictable package of things, but you need to go early. So that you'll have a bit more bargaining power in relation to the IMF while your reserves are higher. So Sri Lanka had gone in January 2022, when it had a couple of billion worth of reserves. It would have been an easier thing to have negotiated than when it really was down to 40 million. Second one is that currency swaps are really what they are. They're just a short-term liquidity instrument. They are not a long-term debt management instrument. And that's what we were trying to use this. And so we need to also look at the conditions for swaps. So we got a swap from China, which at the time looked really good, but it had conditioned that we could only use it if we had 3 months worth of import cover. I'm not even sure if we can use it now. I'm not quite sure if we have 3 months worth of import cover. So it was supposed to be a confidence boosting measure, but I don't think it worked from the credit rating agencies and so on, and it artificially boosted our reserve number because we couldn't use the swap, and an additional permission is needed from China to use it. Safety nets are obviously critical to ensure that the poor and the vulnerable get supported, and you need to have really donor-funded cash transfers at the start of a crisis, and perhaps rationing of food and fuel. I think that becomes really critical at an early stages, but later, rather than have permanent subsidies, I think you need to have a program to move people from welfare to work. And the SME financing aspect is critical, and startup. and retraining of people becomes very important. One hopes the education reform bill does some of that, and banking sector reform also does a lot of work on SME startup with business development services. Macro stability is fundamental. Central bank independence is critical, of course. And then we need a growth plan, which is obviously critical if we want to move out. And I just want to leave you all with some work we did with ODI and the Center for Poverty Analysis. And this can be found on the website of ODI. There's a matrix. It's a research group. Dirk was part of it. Indrajit Coomaraswamy was part of it, and many others. And we tried to come up with a growth plan for Sri Lanka as an independent group of analysts and others. And we tried to think of how you go from cyclical recovery to a bit more of a structurally led process. And there are many, many measures that you may look at your leisure. And we tried to look at 6 headings. And this idea of having an independent growth commission seemed a very important idea for government to have. But equally, many measures to deal with the poverty aspect, but also to try to promote supply chains. FTA is important, dealing with the tariff structure, right? Because you need to deal with streamlining the tariffs, others you can't get the intermediate goods going across borders. A lot of economic diplomacy by revamping the missions. So really the best missions and the biggest missions should really be in India, in China, in countries where we also think of FTAs. Thailand is another one. Cut red tape for business is terribly important. FDI promotion is critical, and so on and so forth. And a lot of work on factor markets. We need a land bank. We need to massively improve female participation rates, particularly in an environment where we have an aging population and things of this type. Land bank is an issue. So there's a lot of stuff we need to do if we want this economy to begin to grow. So just in conclusion, Sri Lanka has sort of had this tag in my mind of a development reversal case, right? And mainly because it's failed to translate these advantages that Amartya Sen, that Stiglitz have talked about into a robust development growth story, right? And if you think of Taiwan or Taipei, China, as an interesting example, another small island that has done that in the shadow of a great big country like China. We have India on our doorstep. We haven't managed to do this, and others have done. And there are other examples of this. And then it goes into this crisis. And then the real question is, is this time different? Are we going to use this IMF program to build a sustainable growth strategy? We're going to need, 4.8% growth is great. It's cyclical, of course. It's not structural. The IMF is thinking 3.1. We really need growth of 5, 6, 7% export-led if we're going to come out of this, right? Tourism is something that has, grown very rapidly, but I don't know if that's enough. There are other sources. The government has done continuity with the program and some proper spend, but we really need to think beyond that. And there are lots of lessons that you might want to take away from the IMF program. Thank you very much, Amrita.
Thank you so much.
You happy standing here?
I'm just going to invite.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'm just taking shit. Thank you so much, Ganesh, for the very comprehensive presentation on Sri Lanka's experience. And as all comprehensive presentations do, you have a lot of questions from the audience. But before going there, I'd like to first invite Raphie and then Indrajit to provide discussant comments, and then we'll take the questions. Raphie, over to you. Would you like to? Yeah, please, sir.
Those are my notes. Scribbled out everything I'd written down to say, anyway. Thank you. Very clear presentation. And a comprehensive presentation. Hans Singer, I suppose most of you know the name, instrumental in the IDS, used to say when he worked in East Africa, that you could go to a country for a week, I think it might have been done these years. You go to a country for a week, you can write a book. Go to a country for 3 months, you can write a monograph. Go to a country for 9 months, you can write an article. Stay any longer, you don't know what to say. So my knowledge about Sri Lanka other than being a tourist, is an occasion with Richard. In 1970, I was on the ILO employment mission.
Yeah.
I came from a very beautiful city in the world, Cape Town. We used to go watch the sunsets every night in Cape Town. Went to Sri Lanka. I was the research assistant, the ILO employment mission. Went and sat on the sea when all the honchos were talking important things. Sunset, fantastic. I wrote to my wife saying, isn't Buddhism a wonderful culture? There's so many people sitting on the coast watching the sunset. Within 10 days, the country was on fire. Between 20 and 30,000 young people were murdered, and we saw bodies floating down the river. So from that expert knowledge of being in Sri Lanka for 3 weeks, 3 things have stayed with me. Firstly, revolutions occur when there's a crisis in expectations. We don't get revolutions when people are poor. We get revolutions when people are poor and expect more, or as in the case of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, when living standards decline very substantially and you get this conflict between expectations and what's there. And the problem was that, as you said, in 1970, Sri Lanka was a highly developed country with massive investments in education, particularly of young people with high expectations of what education could deliver and with no prospect of those expectations being met. The second thing I learned from Sri Lanka then, and as a South African, of course, this means a lot to me, is the inflammatory nature of ethnic conflict. And as we know, Sri Lanka descended into massive ethnic conflict between the Christians in Jaffna, is that right? Tamils in Jaffna, but yeah, and the Buddhists for most of the country. So that's always stuck with me, how social systems can fragment when you don't have homogeneity of and inclusion, which comes with a more integrated society. And the third one was a meeting Richard, I don't know if you remember, the famous Indian economist K.N. Raj, the father of Indian planning, said, I'm sitting in Colombo. Colombo and Tamil Nadu are effectively the same. Similar ecological systems, similar population size, similar whatever it is. Sri Lanka can become like Tamil Nadu. And of course, what we see in Sri Lanka is that it absolutely has not become like Tamil Nadu. So what I'm going to drive to, and I want to come back to at the end, is that the story of Sri Lanka's past and the prospects for a future do not lie primarily in the domain of economic policy. They lie primarily in the political economy, the social fabric within which systems accumulate. And I'll try and come back to that in the end. T. Lawrence Arabia, was he at Cambridge or Oxford? I can't remember. When he was undergraduate, faced his exams with a paper and they asked him about study, if he was supposed to be studying. He was 19 at the time, and he wrote a note saying, I don't know anything about this, but I do know about medieval fortifications. T. Lawrence, at the age of 19, was the world expert on medieval fortifications. And he said, what I would like to do, instead of all the stuff you asked me, is to tell you about medieval fortifications. Now, of course, it's only Oxbridge that thinks that this is exactly what you should do, but he got a first, and he did more than that with his life. So I'm in T. Lawrence's territory. I've read your paper. I hear the macroeconomics, but actually I know about completely different things, and I would like to address that if you don't mind.
Please.
But a little bit of criticism, not of you personally, but this is a disciplinary problem. Often I feel that macroeconomics and trade policies are the consequences of more important things rather than the causes of problems. And you've given us a story which essentially tells us about this developmental reversal and the crisis in recent years in Sri Lanka as a consequence of particular types of macroeconomic policy. And I want to abstract from that, because I think if we need to understand what's been happening in Sri Lanka and what we need to do, we need to move away from the macroeconomic policies and to try and understand what's happening on the ground. So when you don't know anything about a topic, you ask your friends. I contacted the gurus of GVCs, Gary Raphie, Stephanie Barrientos. Please, can you give me something on the apparel industry in Sri Lanka? 40% of exports in 1924 of total exports were apparel. It has the highest per capita exports in the garment sector of any country in the region. 15% of the labor force are in the apparel sector, and 86% of the sector's exports go to the EU and Europe. And that's all I could find on the garment and apparel industry in Sri Lanka. So my first question is, do we understand why it is that Sri Lanka has such a high level of concentration in the apparel sector? Do we understand why it is, and I think we do, why these exports predominantly go to the US and Europe, and I could come back to that as well? And why was there an absence of diversification? Diversification in two senses of the word. Why the concentration on the apparel sector, and why no deepening within the apparel sector? And one of the striking things about the Korean story and the Chinese story is that in any value chain they were in, they started off with assembly, and then they went deeper and deeper, creating more and more value and moving from low value activities to high value activities. So here's the first question to you. Why the concentration on apparel? And what was the failure of the capitalist class in Sri Lanka? That A, it confined itself to the apparel sector, and B, even within the apparel sector, it showed so little sign of deepening of value added and deepening of knowledge. Okay. Why so little dynamism in structure of the economy? Thirdly, how might we change that when we get to policy? And I didn't realize you were hoping that I would speak about supply chains and value chains, but since you challenged me, a lot of my crossings out are quickly, what the hell am I going to say about supply chains and value chains, right? So some things we've learned about value chains. Firstly, the key thing about value chains is it tells you it starts with the buyers. Who are the buyers in these value chains? Now, the only case in Africa of successful export-oriented industrialization, which incidentally was undermined by ethnic conflict and inequality, was Ethiopia. What did Ethiopia do? They started off with the export processing zones by going to the buyers, and they said, what do you want? Not starting off with their capabilities and where they'd been good at in the past. And the buyers said, you know what? Most of our clothing exports come from South Asia, and they are legacy value chains. We don't have any value chains out there which are green. And that was the key for the Ethiopians. They moved into green value chains so that they used renewable energy, They moved for renewables to get to the coast. It was green, the water was recycled, and their niche in the global apparel industry was green value chains in the apparel sector, beginning with the buyers. Now, when I worked in Kenya, I was struck by the number of Sri Lankan firms producing clothes in Kenya for export to the US under the GOA preferential trade entry. So somewhere in there, if we're trying to understand about the deficit of capitalist dynamism and accumulation in Sri Lanka, is an understanding of who were these Sri Lankan firms, which buyers they're working with. What were the buyers confining them to? When we worked in the furniture industry, IKEA would allow the buyers to improve process, the producers to improve process. They wouldn't allow them to innovate in products. So what is the lock-in? And I want to come back to this now that with the growing tariffs in the US. What were the lock-ins in the apparel value chains which so dominated Sri Lankan manufacturing, which led them to a world in which there was no scope for dynamism? And for that, you need to understand the governors of these value chains, which were the key firms governing and driving the value chains, and where were they going. Now to two more problematic things, and then I'll finish. With a colleague, I've just written a large report for UNIDO for the future of UNIDO. The report is entitled Beyond Catch-up, the End of Business as Usual. We are now in a stage of the fracturing of a period of global accumulation, particularly capitalist accumulation, in which export-oriented industrialization provided a major window of opportunity to some developing country exporters. The story is, when productivity growth in the US slowed in the 1970s and profit rates in the US slowed in the 1970s, instead of investing in a new form of productivity enhancing growth, they went to cheap labor in developing countries in general and China in particular. It's gone, right? It's gone. Mass production and that paradigm which dominated the 20th century, where globalization was necessary to the survival of what is now an outdated system of production, is gone. There will still be south to north trade, but the flying geese strategy of following first Japan and then following China and hoping to fill the spaces left open as China moved up the value chain have gone. So what is the challenge for developing countries when you want to expand exports and this conveyor belt to North America and Europe is no longer there? Challenge number one. Challenge number two, in Africa, most of Latin America, and most of South Asia, and I'm interested to know what the Sri Lankan story is, outside of agriculture, between 60 and 70% of the population earn their livelihoods in informal sector activities. Precarious livelihoods, often illegal livelihoods, and are the source of migration and all the things that we know about it. So we have to try to think of a development strategy which somehow incorporates this population in the future. The trouble is, as Danny Roderick has shown, manufacturing is no longer an employment-intensive sector. It's true not just of the North, but right through the world, manufacturing will not employ people. So the first challenge is what to do when there's no conveyor belt to the North. The second challenge is what are we going to do about more inclusion in society at large, particularly inclusion of those who are marginalized in the informal sector. And this is a big challenge. It's not a challenge in which the sorts of macroeconomic policy we're talking about now addresses. It's the sort of thing which all countries are now having to address. So I'm sorry I've gone on too long, but just to go back to the beginning. I believe, but I don't know, that an understanding of Sri Lanka's past and its opportunities in the future are to be found in the social and the political realm. I don't mean political as in political parties, but political as in political economy. I would love to have been told by Gary Gireffi and Stephanie Barrientos, here are a series of studies which tell you what really is happening in the garments industry and why things have turned out the way they are. I observe an absence of it. So I would love to hear from you, and perhaps a challenge to the community, just to know more about the real world. I'm sorry to say, and this is not about you personally, I feel that macroeconomic policy is a symptom of what's happening in the underlying economy. But the story which macroeconomics and trade policy tells us is that macroeconomic policy and trade policy is the explanation of what's happened. So I have a disagreement with you of a fundamental nature, but it's not an interpersonal disagreement, and it's not a disagreement about the quality of what you're doing, but what do we need to understand about the world? And in doing that, what are the policy levers we need to address? And I feel that the macroeconomic policy sides of those policy levers are much less important than understanding the dynamics of accumulation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please, Indrajit, would you like to go next? And then we can give Ganesh the floor to respond, please.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank both Ganeshan and Raphie for the excellent presentations. Ganeshan's were the real tour de force of really the story of Sri Lanka's development reversal. And Raphie has given us some very interesting insights as to how we could look at the problem. I'm going to be, my background is central banking, so I'm going to be very boring. I'm going to try to answer the question as to what we need to do to avoid having another IMF program when the current one ends in April 2028. And here I think we have two challenges. One is to ensure that the new macroeconomic paradigm that has been introduced over the last couple of years and has yielded good results in terms of stabilizing the economy is maintained. So I'm going against what Raphie has told us, really saying that we have to fix the macro before we can move forward. Second thing is that we need to develop an outward-looking economy where growth is driven by FDI and exports. In our case, we've had an inward-looking economy, an economy which has become increasingly inward-looking, and where the growth has been driven by foreign borrowing and non-tradable. Is that a disturbance on the line? Anyway, non-tradables and borrowing, external borrowing and non-tradable. So these are the things that we need to address. So on the macro, much of the heavy lifting has already been done under the IMF program. Historically, the main source of instability has been the government's budget. There has been a toxic combination of populist politics and entrenched entitlement culture among the people, which has led to fiscal instability. This has happened time and again. And that is what's led to these 17 IMF programs. Each time there is a program, we do some stabilization, but when the next election approaches, everything is let loose and we go back to square one. So we have to sort that out. And the second issue that we have at hand is that the monetary policy has had a great deal of fiscal dominance. The central bank has lent excessively to the government. It has perpetrated financial repression to keep interest rates artificially down, to provide cheap money to the government, and also to provide a boost, artificial boost to the growth rate. So these kind of policy missteps have been repeated time and again. I think it was Einstein who said that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing and again and to expect different outcomes. In Sri Lanka's case, this is what we were guilty of. So we had consistently had excessive fiscal deficits, and we did excessive monetary expansion through the central bank and financial repression. And time and again, we would go back to square one. Now, we have now got a five-pillared framework for macroeconomic management, which hopefully gets us to a different place. There is the Public Finance Management Act, which enshrines a primary surplus in the budget every year. Between 1954 and 2022, Sri Lanka had only 4 years where it had a primary surplus in the budget. So now, and in the last, since 2023 rather, there has been an 8% of GDP turnaround in the primary surplus of the budget, in the primary balance of the budget. I mean, that is extremely painful. And sadly, this is the situation we've got. You know, Ganeshan pointed out that we left it too late. The reason why we've had such a harsh adjustment is because we left it late, and our reserves had come down to 20 million US dollars in an economy which had an import bill of 20 billion and debt servicing obligations of 6 billion per year. So in such a situation, clearly the adjustment when the IMF came, they've stipulated that to restore balance in the economy, one had to undertake extremely painful programs, and the burden was borne disproportionately by the poor. So now we have got in place this framework, which hopefully, both on the fiscal side, has addressed the problem of continuous borrowing to fund the budget, the current budget. No, not for capital expenditure, but the current budget. The second thing is the Central Bank Act has now prevented the central bank from lending to the government. It is prohibited. There is no more deficit financing in the form of the participation in the primary auctions or in temporary overdrafts for the government. In addition, financial repression is no longer possible because the flexible inflation targeting is a regime that has been adopted for monetary policy formulation. So therefore, that is a data-driven process, and you can't administratively fix interest rates anymore. The third thing is that there is a commitment to have cost-reflective pricing for the SOE sector, particularly energy and electricity. Now, in the past, what we've had is the budget has been constrained, put under strain by the losses made through subsidizing electricity and fuel. The balance sheets of the state banks have been put under strain because these losses were placed on their balance sheets. And we also had the wrong instrument to provide social protection. We had untargeted subsidies, which benefited the non-poor disproportionately, rather than targeted cash transfers, which is what we move to now under the new dispensation. So that's been quite a lot of cleaning up in terms of the operations of the state-owned enterprises as well, in terms of the pressure they put on the system. Fourth pillar is the anti-corruption, the anti-corruption law that is coming, which is well aligned with the UN Anti-Corruption Convention, and also the IMF has conducted a corruption diagnostic, and the 16 recommendations of that report are currently being implemented. So these things that need to be done need to be kept intact and to make sure that we don't slip back into another round of macroeconomic stress. So that's one. So I said there were two challenges. So the first one regarding ensuring that there is avoidance of macroeconomic stress. Much of the work has been done. One needs to make sure we keep it intact. In the past, too, we made some progress on these fronts, but there would be policy reversal, particularly when an election approached. This time, the positive steps have been enshrined in acts of parliament. But of course, they can be changed with a simple majority in parliament. So we need to make sure that the public is aware of the need to ensure that the macroeconomic stress that has hit the economy time and again is avoided. That's critical that this new paradigm for macroeconomic policy making is kept intact. But the more challenging thing of developing an outward-looking economy, which is driven by exports and FDI rather than borrowing and non-tradables, there we are still at the beginning of the story. Some progress is being made, but there's a lot more to do. You know, when the economy was liberalized in 1977, the president of the time spoke about exporting or perishing. So some progress was made up to 2000. Since then, we have gone backwards. exports as a percentage of GDP have halved, tradables as a percentage of GDP have halved, and we've had para-tariffs, which have kept us out of the most dynamic component of the international trading system. That is in terms of the supply chains around the world. Sri Lanka's, I think, intermediate exports are less than 5%. I believe countries like Malaysia, Thailand have intermediate exports of 50% or more. So we have been excluded from that whole scenario, which Raphie now said, of course, may not be as attractive as it was a few years ago. So that's essentially, I mean, we have known for years what needs to be done in terms of the SOE reforms, the investment climate, the investment promotion, trade policy, trade facilitation, education, training, and skills development. And now, of course, there's an additional thing, and that is the digitalization and particularly the development of the public development infrastructure. So those things the government is beginning to move on. There's a lot to do. And if we are to avoid going to another program, we need to make significant progress on all those fronts. So are there any lessons learned which other countries could find useful? One is this, to have clear frameworks for policy making, macro policy making, before you graduate. Sri Lanka was a donor darling. Sri Lanka was the second country after Chile to liberalize its economy of those countries that followed autarkic policies. But when we did that, there were generous amounts of foreign aid that came. We absorbed it, but did not undertake the structural reforms that put the economy on the basis of sustained growth and development. Now we need to shift right through the system to a process of bringing on board the kinds of policies that shift the economy to an outward-looking stance. The protection in the economy increased dramatically. That's why you had this halving of the export sector, and also you had the non-tradables going up because of the significant loss of policies which were favorable towards there was an anti-export bias in the policy framework, which made the vision of an export-led economy not feasible. So Sri Lanka has gone backwards on this front, but it is making an attempt to reverse that. But it's still too early to tell how convincing the government's efforts are going to be on this front, and we need to make sure that this happens. It's not enough just to have the macro, because the macro is not going to see. There are a couple of urgent reasons why we need to get growth going. One is to reverse the very sharp increase in poverty that has taken place. The people have been extraordinarily patient, but they may not continue to be patient if there isn't an improvement in their living standards. The second thing is also that we need to ensure that our debt remains sustainable. So for that, it's important that there is sufficient growth to ensure that that sustainability is achieved. At the moment, we're ahead of the game. As Ganeshan said, we've had fairly positive growth of close to 5%, but it is based on transitory factors. So unless we sustain growth of close to 5% or more, there is always the danger that we will slip back into debt unsustainability. So for those reasons, it's very important that we do the structural changes. And we need to ask ourselves, why haven't these structural changes been implemented? We have known for many years what needs to be done, the things that I recited, but they don't get done for two reasons. One is the long gestation period for those kinds of structural reforms, and politicians do not have the kind of vision to make sure that they implement policies that go beyond one electoral cycle. And the more important reason for non-implementation of structural reforms is the vested interest, strong vested interest, sometimes businesses, sometimes trade unions, etc., which block reforms for their own interests. And this has happened time and again. So we need to move beyond all this and implement these reforms. And one other thing, this is in line with Raphie's point about making sure that we understand the underlying dynamics in terms of socio-political factors. We need to see India as an opportunity rather than as a threat. Sri Lanka, the DNA of Sri Lankans is to see India as a threat. And if you have a $4 trillion economy at your doorstep, and the 5 southern states are probably growing at double digits, not to see that as an opportunity in terms of greater integration clearly is extremely foolish in my view. But I hope that we are able to transcend the past and see what opportunities that can be got by integrating more with India. But of course, we need to do that while protecting our national interests as best as we can. But we need to have a more dynamic, open attitude to taking advantage of the opportunities of a 4 trillion economy at our doorstep. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There is really important learning here, Ganesh, from I think your presentation, but also from the very detailed comments from the discussants, good examples of what worked and hasn't worked. We have a very long list of questions from the audience online, but which will be sent to you. But I wanted to highlight maybe 2 aspects before we open the floor for quick questions from the audience in person here. And I'll exploit my position as chair and add my question as well. I have a question on strategy and geopolitics, which I wasn't sure if it was in your matrix there. Raphie talked about macro and trade policy, kind of being more of a consequence rather than a cause. I would kind of, ask the question if it's actually a bit of both. And the question we should be asking is about policy coherence. How do we ensure that the different policy or policy prescriptions we're deriving kind of speak to each other? And so with that respect, I want to, and this has also been asked from the audience, how should Sri Lanka position itself geopolitically? We are seeing increasing role of new kinds of collaborations geographically. ASEAN is making leaps in terms of geopolitical relations and diplomacy and trade relations. You mentioned that Sri Lanka can help, geographically, but it hasn't really translated. So I wonder what your thoughts were. But let me first see if we have any questions from the audience for you. I think we'll be able to take 3 short questions. If anybody, 2 to 3 short questions. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is John York. Very simple question. I think we've indicated that growth needs to be around 5% to sustain the servicing of debts. And the IMF have indicated the growth forecast of 3.1. And you quite correctly, Ganesh, articulated that in your report. Does that mean, and Indrajit has indicated that we need to try and avoid another round of IMF, 18th one. How do we get that growth going? It is so important. And I think we indicated a few points, but I don't know how to move forward on that. And any comments will come.
Hello, I'm Dr. Fellow from ODI, and thank you, Amrita, for putting this seminar together. Thank you, Ganesh, for the wonderful presentation, and also the comments by Raphie, both Raphie and Indrajit. And perhaps I'm going to ask you, Ganesh, whether you think there may be actually commonalities between the presentations. They both wanted to sort of differentiate from each other, basically, about the role of macro. But where I think Indrajit was finishing was that it's really important to think about the framework behind macroeconomic policy, and that there's sort of consensus behind the importance of macro and other policies moving forward, and that is, of course, goes into sort of the political economy aspects already, and that may be helpful. And the other perhaps question is on is that Sri Lanka has so far focused a lot on US and Europe for the supply chains and for the value chains, but maybe in the future it isn't just those kind of countries, right? So you have more regional approach in Africa. You have more regional approaches with AFCFTA, maybe also, and something that Indrajit was mentioning was about India. So maybe Sri Lanka should focus more on regional markets, and that could be the focus of the supply chains. And the final quick point on the lessons for so you have 5 lessons, Danish, all very important. Are they could be termed better like emerging lessons? Then, because I suppose some of them Sri Lanka hasn't really fulfilled yet, and some of them may have done. And the one thing point you mentioned was about early going to IMF early. I would also say what tends to be a focus of for IMF programs is important to think about structuring and comprehensive structuring right away, and don't wait for too long. So if you wait too long, you get a grease 10 years of underperformance. But if you do it more quickly, and I wonder what you think about Sri Lanka. Has it gone to the IMF a bit more quickly than others? Has it gone? Is it doing things a bit more quickly than others? And now the question is what's going well. So, or do you think that Sri Lanka was not fast enough and it should have been faster?
One last question.
So much for the presentation, Ganeshan. I'm Marco Carreras, I'm a research fellow at IDS. I have a question about the fiscal capacity of the state, because we know that in Sri Lanka, more or less 15% of the population actually file a tax return. I would expect 70% of them to be nil filers. And there is quite a bit of interest on public debt and public finances. Is there any discussion besides the classic recommendation of increasing tax revenue that is done by IMF when they give you a loan in order to change this aspect? Because I mean, it's pretty much in line with many other similar countries, yet still only 15% file tax returns. And again, I assume a minority of them pays anything in taxes. Is there anything there that is planned in order to change this fiscal capacity of the state?
Thank you. I think that's plenty of food for thought for Ganesh to summarize your responses.
Thank you very much. On Marco's last question, there are some attempts to get widen the tax base and to get people to pay better and improve the tax administration. But the one that hasn't really done quite as much is really the tax incentives that have been given, the tax holidays, for instance, for business with the port city and other things, and also corporate tax rates. I think that also needs to be looked at. There's some discussion of other taxes, wealth tax, property tax, very much like what's being discussed here, right? And those are coming. But the problem is that we're squeezing the middle class, and we've had 1 million in the country. And I think if tax rates rise, they will just leave even greater. So there is that problem, right? I think the spend also has to be looked at very carefully. The spend part, while it's not so as a percentage of GDP, there's still a lot of government waste, particularly state-owned enterprises. And we have 2 million plus public servants, if you count the military as well. And I think, in Sri Lanka, we just don't have the labor for the private sector, right? So there has to be a comprehensive look at restructuring government and government services and so on. And I think this is obviously complicated given the ideology of government, right? And so on. But I think we have to look at that clearly. Dirk's points are very valuable points. Yes, there are common points between Raphie and Indrajit in the sense of micro versus macro. And I think but his point is that we don't have that framework in place, which I think is critical, right? But we have to do a lot more micro and meso policy, which is what you're saying. And I think that's absolutely right. And you're also right that lessons. I've sort of, I try to think of other countries not doing Sri Lanka, right? So these 5 things are things that I think are important, right? But it's obviously context specific. And right, also we have to really come up with a comprehensive program. That's where the whole bit comes in, right? So we kind of took the IMF program, we need to do a whole part of that. And I would have liked us to have had a group that thought about the IMF program as it comes up. And that's something government should do, anticipating that we need another one very soon.
Greece, the difference in Greece, it is relevant. We have talked about a lot. Much bigger IMF program, a lot of European Investment Bank money. It's really $100 million, something like that. Sri Lanka got tiny amount of money. Greece got a lot of money, right? So even that was a problem. So we need to really think of a $3 billion plus. I don't know, another 4-5 billion from the Indian World Bank. That's 1/10 of what Greece got. Pakistan is a very different story. We could do another session on Pakistan. Political economy plays a major role in Pakistan. It isn't quite with us, but you're absolutely right. Emerging lessons, and we should think of more cooperation. So I think this report has 30 recommendations for our growth. Please read it. So that's simple. I'll give you a copy if you want. And we need a comprehensive approach. The government is being piecemeal, right? So going after some little thing with the pepper producer, some little thing for Jim, that's not going to cut the export growth. There's to be a lot of the distortions being taken away. And to cut the red tape, you have to make the thing, but also a few sectoral interventions. I'm hesitant to talk about comprehensive industrial policy because we just don't have the capacity to do that yet. And there's a risk of more distortions coming in as a result of this if we don't do it well. So we need certain sector interventions, but whether we can put together an industrial policy, I don't think we can at this stage. We don't really have the technocrats or the ability to do so at the moment. I think it's very important and interesting points. I think you're absolutely right. We have to think of the foreign bias. We have to think of the bias strategies, and that's what you've been writing for so long. I remember being very influenced on your work, and we probably have 15 different buyers, Victoria's Secret's being a very important one, Marks and Spencer being another. They all have different interests and they all have different groups. And I think we need to be thinking much more. We don't think about that in the Export Development Board and things of this type of how we attempt to deal with the buyers and try to use the buyers as a tool of moving up the ladder, which I think is important. I don't think we've really got a handle on that. The other point is the political economy side of this also definitely comes into play, and really that's around creating a local identity and sort of a post-conflict healing and things of that type, right? Which it's been a country with a lot of complex politics and violence over the years, right? And this government, at least the talk is that they want that. They want a national vision. They want this, and for that they get credit in my book. The president went to Jaffna. He's been talking about putting infrastructure projects in the north. I mean, there's a lot of that which I think is very important, but there's perhaps more to be done in terms of the healing ethnically and other things that has to be done. So that becomes important. I think very importantly raised was this thing about macro versus micro. I think it's a graduated set of policies we need to think about. You need the macro, unstable macro, no matter how much you do sectoral and micro policy, you're going to get not much, right? So the two are completely linked. Where government is lacking is on the micro and the meso policy at the moment. So we need a much more comprehensive approach. And I'm not sure, I mean, the IMF, we had an interaction with the IMF team recently, and they are very keen to support efforts to talk about a reform program, but they don't really see that as part of their mandate. Their mandate is basically making the public finances sustainable and dealing with the current account, but they don't necessarily want to go forward. That's the donor coordination, but please,
yeah, of course. Should we get that ready for you? Please.
Sorry, everything's done such shorthand. Of course, if you have a bad macroeconomic environment, nothing works. But forgive me, I don't wish this to be inflammatory. It's a bit like neoliberalism. If only we get the fundamentals right, the economy will respond appropriately. Doesn't work that way. And what your macroeconomic does, it gets rid of the distortions which stop things happening. But an awful lot else has to happen, which won't be addressed through macro policy. But I think we agree on that.
Yeah, no, I agree
on that.
No, absolutely. And I think there's also a question of public sector capacity, which has to be built up to do all this, right? We've had difficulty for various reasons of getting a simple set of macro policy. I think there's a capacity issue, there's a rent-seeking issue, and there is an issue of lack of awareness of economics, let alone micro or macro. And the public sector is very weak compared to before. And so I'm hesitant
to have too much intervention, because I just don't think our current group of technocrats, bar some, can actually do it. But that said, we need to think much more closely. And we tried with this report. We got 9 people together under the auspices of ODI and the Center for Poverty Analysis in Sri Lanka to try to come up with a program to help government think through this a bit. And it's the start of a program. And the points Indrajit raised, yeah, no, absolutely. I think these points are terribly important. The export-oriented side is even more so. And definitely the geopolitical question you posed, Amrita. Yes, I think with India coming to help us, and the truth be told, China gave us 2 lots of 500 million at 6%. Everything comes at 6%. They didn't come with the 5 to 10 billion, which is what the regime wanted at the time, which is why we came to that person. The regime kept thinking China will come. But we didn't want to come in Hobson's choice. And I think that's very clear now. I have a feeling that India is going to take its own national security concerns much more seriously now in the Sri Lankan case. And it's going to be very hard for any external country to come into Sri Lanka very easily without consent. And that's going to be really tricky given the politics of where we are today globally. So I think that's by definition, and it was very interesting. The Prime Minister went to China on a big visit, and then immediately she went to India. So that's an interesting illustration of what I've just said. So I think we need to be concerned, but rather than worry about that side of it, geography drives trade. Krugman's anecdote is very powerful, to me at least. And you've talked about that in the micro context. So I think it's natural to try to get the spillovers of Indian growth and to integrate into that. And that's just a natural thing. And if we can get some investment from China and others in an East Asia style thing, that's very useful. Our set is perhaps a bridge too far given where we are in our domestic regulation, but maybe that's something we should think about. Clearly we have to try to diversify the sources of where we export and get FDI and so on. But it will take time. So I think we need to recognize our political reality and geopolitical reality while trying to do what we can. And that's where the promotion tools come in, right? We have all these embassies in strange locations which are not geared towards this. We haven't done the trade agreements necessarily with the Asian countries. We haven't tried to do much more, state visits. And there's lots we can do, right? And business to business has to be there. So I think I've dealt with most of them. Is that okay?
Yes. Thank you so much. Well, that's all the time we've got today, but feel free to, say hi to Ganesh here. But thank you very much to all of you and to our audience online. So see you next time. Thank you.